Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Remedying the Adult Reading Rift, from Foundational Skills to Reading Proficiency. Today's webinar is hosted and sponsored by Reading Horizons, and today we have Laura Axtell, who's going to be our presenter. If you'd like to say hello to her in the chat box, let us know where you're calling in from today. If you have any questions during her presentation, feel free to submit those in the Q&A box. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen, get us started. I'm really excited that so many people have registered and are joining us today. This webinar actually came out of a presentation that I did at the COEB conference this year in Nashville. And so many people asked for further information and slides and things like that, that we thought it might be a good idea to present that as a webinar. So thank you for joining us. We're going to be doing 2 additional webinars, one in May, one in June, on some topics that we'll talk about at the end of the presentation. We invite you to join us for those as well. You'll get a recording and a certificate, but we'll also be sharing some resources after today's session. So we're going to be using the chat a good bit. So get your fingers ready because it's really helpful to have information from people as we're going through, and we love to have participation. So let's start by thinking about your classroom. In the last 2 years, specifically in the last 2 years, have you seen some changes or some significant differences in the populations that you're serving than you saw maybe in the past? So for example, are you seeing greater diversity in the ability levels of your students? Maybe, higher level students or a lot more lower level students? What about more multilingual learners? Maybe that wasn't a huge population for your program in the past, and now it is becoming larger, or that you're just seeing more diversity in languages, maybe languages you haven't seen before, including some dialectical languages that maybe just didn't show up in your program before. So could you just think a little bit about what changes, if any, have you seen, and then put them in the chat, because that's really helpful data to gather since we have so many people from such different parts of the world. And while you're doing that, the next thing we're going to do is a bit of a poll. So keep going ahead and do that. And then we're going to take a little bit of a poll because, again, data is really important. So the first question is, has your reading instruction in the past or currently generally focused more on reading strategies and comprehension? So has that been the primary focus of your reading instruction, is really building comprehension skills? And then, so just click yes or no, and then we'll see what people say about that. And then the second question is, do you feel as knowledgeable as you would like to about teaching reading? So with the populations that you're seeing, how comfortable and confident do you feel about your ability to serve the needs of all those various students? Okay, so we'll be able to see some of that information. So I want to jump right in, but before we do, I would really, usually when people go to webinars, there's lots of great information. Okay, so here's our poll so far. So most people, the 78% said yes, reading instruction has generally focused on strategies and comprehension. And most people, 69% said no, about feeling as confident and comfortable as they would like to about teaching reading. So great, thank you very much for that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So as we go through the session, one of the things that I always notice from going to conference sessions and being on webinars and things like that is, lots of great information, but how do I actually apply this? What can I take away? So what I'd like you to do is, as we're going through this information, identify an aha moment. something that is an actual useful item that you could use in your instruction, or something that could be actionable that you could start implementing, and jot it down, because I'd really like to have some time at the end when we do questions to have some of that discussion. Some of this may be very new information to people, and it's always helpful to know, okay, what's your takeaway? So moving forward, I want to start by talking about the challenges of adult and correctional education. And if you work in this space, you know this intimately. It's your everyday world, right? But these are relatively very recent statistics. So I just want to talk about the fact that it is changing across what we're seeing across the board. Now, in a recent poll within the last 2 years, 54% of US adults read below a basic level. And when we say basic, that generally means below 6th grade, right? And so that is a definite increase in the number of adults who are not reading proficiently, 54%, over half. High school graduates, so students who have graduated from high school with a high school diploma, 19%, or almost 20% of those students, 1/5 of those graduates, cannot read above a basic level. But when we get into corrections, when we're talking about adults in custody, the statistics show 70% of adults in custody don't read above a basic level. So in the adult space, we have a tremendous need. And because we focused on certain characteristics of reading in the past, we may not be as effective in meeting the needs of the students that we're seeing now, those English language learners, those students with lower level skills and other challenges. And what we know now, because we have so much more research about dyslexia, is, and this study I love because, again, it's relatively recent, and it took place in Louisiana, which has a high per capita incarceration rate, and it included men and women. So what their study showed is that 47% of the students in their study showed characteristics of dyslexia. So almost half. 36% were proficient readers, so about a third, and then 17% had cognitive impairments. And that, again, if you're working in the correction space, know that that probably is, not a new or surprising statistic. But we also know that there are lots of challenges in that particular area, because it may be dyslexia, it may be a cognitive impairment, but it could be lots of other things too. So we do lots of work in correction. So you may have an older adult in custody who has hearing issues or hearing loss. You may have students they're not necessarily cognitive impairments, but other challenges. And maybe they were classified in special ed when they were in school, and probably they may not have been. A lot of times there were other challenges like traumatic brain injuries, lots of drug and alcohol use that could impact that. So there's so many, we see such a diverse group of students, but we also know now, based on 2 studies, that the percentage of our incarcerated population generally shows more than double the average that we see in the general population with dyslexia, which is about 20%. And that should help us understand why we see so many of our students who are challenged readers and who struggle to even gain the skills when we present them. So this is why I think this information is really important, because if that's the case, if we know about those challenges and we know about the need, where do we go from here? And that's where the science is really leading us to the solutions. So I want to start with a couple of basic things. And this is all, again, connected to research and science that's been happening for over 4 decades now. The problem is it often just didn't filter down to us in the practical classrooms, right? And so, as many of you mentioned, our focus has been on comprehension, reading to gain meaning. What we now know is that there are 2 primary components of comprehension. One is decoding of text. You have to be able to figure out what the word is. And second, you have to know what the word means, that language comprehension, along with other parts of those things. But the simple view of reading says decoding times language comprehension equals language comprehension equals reading comprehension, right? This is a product, though, not a sum, which means that if your decoding skills are not proficient, if you're not an accurate and automatic decoder, and so they're less than total, even if you know what the words mean, even if you have a very good language comprehension, 0.5 times 1 is still 0.5. And it's vice versa as well. If you can't decode the text, even if you know what the word means, I'm sorry, vice versa. Even if you can decode the text, but you don't know what the word means, then you can't comprehend for reading. So the simple view of reading helps us understand those two components are where we have to really focus when comprehension is an issue. And Scarborough's reading rope is a really helpful way of identifying what we've been doing and what we may need to change doing based on the research. So if we take those two components, I'm going to start with language comprehension because for many, many years in adult ed, we've started with a top-down approach, which means we focused on those strands in the upper skills, like, close reading strategies, vocabulary, background knowledge, subject text, tier 3 vocabulary, that kind of thing. What we now know, though, is that our students who are not reading proficiently must start so we need to do a bottom-up approach. They must start with those word recognition skills. That includes understanding of how sounds and letters work together, really focusing on orthographic mapping of words so that the brain can store words that may be of irregular spelling, connected to pronunciation and meaning, and that those skills have to become automatic. So as students develop those skills, those solid word recognition skills, then we can begin to add in those strands at the upper level. While we're doing that, obviously, we're not going to wait until we get to, proficient readers to begin doing that. That's why the rope is really important to think about as an understanding of how this happens over time, that these are strands that we weave in, and those upper strands become strategic. And that over time is how we build, skilled readers. So when we're talking about older students, a couple things change. We don't generally in the adult world talk about phonemic awareness or phonics very much. That may not even be a term that's familiar or the understanding is familiar to educators at the upper levels. Often the way we think about it for adults is word study. They've had, at least in most cases, they've had some exposure to text. So they were in school, they've read something, they've, seen words and things like that. So if we think about that beginning part as word study, we move up to fluency, and there's been a lot of discussion around fluency. Fluency means reading should sound like speech, not too fast, not too slow, and we're going at a pace that allows a student to gain meaning from what they're reading. So if a student is reading too slowly and they're laboring over every single word, they'll get to the end of a sentence and they won't remember what they read. So fluency is important because you have to be able to hold on to what you're reading to gain the meaning from it. Vocabulary, every educator I ever talked to knows that the vocabulary of a lot of our students is very weak. And a lot of times that's because they don't read or avoid reading. And so they don't gain a lot of vocabulary from text, which is where we get most of the vocabulary we'll gain in our lifetime is from what we read. And so we have to build in ways to develop and ensure that students are getting that second component, that language comprehension. And then comprehension is not only a goal, it's a skill. So we actually have to teach students strategies for comprehension. And I'm going to share one with you at the end of the session that you will actually practice with. That can be a game changer as we're building skills. But for older students, there's an additional component in the pyramid, and that's motivation. And that nobody has to probably tell you that there's a lot of trauma that's impacted and a lot of psychological impact when you can't read. Generally starting from the time you're in about first grade, where students start to think they must be stupid because they're not able to do things their peers can do. So then can you imagine an adult who spent their entire life, sometimes with special support in school, but a lot of times without, and now they're out in the world, often with their own children. And so the motivation, they've probably tried some things. They might have been in intervention and it's not been very successful. So motivation can be a huge factor. What's really helpful about this, and what I think is the secret sauce, that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we connect those two things, motivation to reading outcomes? And some of this research is really helpful in that, because what we know is that belief in yourself is the most important factor in terms of achievement. And so really, when we're working with struggling readers, English language learners, et cetera, we've got two primary jobs. The first is to increase self-efficacy, the belief that they can do it. And the way that you get them to believe that they can do it is you get them some success right from the beginning. And second, we need to reduce the perceived difficulty. We have made reading way too hard. And one of the things that I often will say is, if you're still using terms like open and closed syllables and CVC and things like that, vowel bridges, it's probably too complicated for your lowest level readers. It increases the cognitive load, things that they have to remember, and we want to decrease the cognitive load and reduce that perceived difficulty. So how do we do that? Well, we have to provide targeted instruction that does what students need it to do. And first of all, that is to, target those unique needs of each student, because students are different. And as you've identified in the chat, you're seeing lots of differences that maybe you didn't before. So learning gaps vary widely in adult populations. Also, again, you have to help students meet reading level expectations more quickly. They need to see that this is making progress toward their individual and sometimes educational goals much faster than they've seen in the past. And when we do that, we mitigate discouragement, because that's often what's happened, is they've just gotten discouraged. They don't see anything happening, and therefore they sometimes, in correctional settings, they'll say, yeah, they don't want to participate, etc. And we have to provide pathways that allow, that time to be used most effectively, leveraging resources, self-directed learning, etc. So targeted instruction is really the key in adult populations. So for goals in adult education, primarily in the past, this is what we've thought about, a high set GED, credit recovery, something like that around education or post-secondary education. Vocational training is a big one, especially for, well, all adults, but especially for adults in custody who are coming back to communities. Vocational training, or, employment and retention, is incredibly important. Employment, just general employment of any kind, and English acquisition for students who are learning the language. So generally, that's what we focused on. But we're going to talk about today that that's not always the goal for many of our students, and that's contributed some to some of the issues with motivation and progress. So how do we do all those things? How do we really increase motivation? How do we increase reading outcomes and proficiency? And how do we make the connection to the goals that students really do have? Well, one is the science of reading and what we know about the brain. We have had research for many years, but it's only in the last couple of decades that we've been able to actually see what the brain is doing while it's reading, through functional MRIs, PET scans, and other ways of identifying what the brain is doing, and also having a model for what that science would look like in a classroom. Because all the knowledge in the world doesn't help you when you're standing in front of your students, and you need the resources to provide that science in practical ways. So when we talk about the science of reading, which is kind of a hot button topic, and probably a lot of people have heard that term, it's actually a pretty generic term. So the science of reading just means that we're going to base what we're doing, our approaches and methods, on what has been found to be effective. And how do we know if something's effective? Because it's been conducted multiple times, replicated many, many times through research. So this is what I didn't understand, and what many of the teachers I train and talk to about in conferences never got information about. And one is that our brain is biologically wired for speech. So if a baby can hear, they're going to learn to speak in whatever language they hear. The brain is just naturally wired for that. However, the reading brain is different. When we go from speech to print, that is not something that the brain is naturally wired to do. So it means that why do we have to go to school? Because we have to learn the code, whatever the code is, of our written language. And so every written language is a code. English is a code, Arabic is a code, Chinese is a code. And you have to know how to understand or break the code, which is why we call reading decoding and why we call spelling encoding, because the brain literally needs to wire neural pathways to make the connection to print. And most research now is showing that somewhere around 40% of brains are not naturally wired. So even with instruction, they need additional support to create those neural pathways. So in summary, reading's not natural for the brain. Robust neural networks have to be developed. And for some students, that means, especially students with severe dyslexia, et cetera, that takes more time. Targeted instruction is the only way that's going to work. What we're doing with reading strategies won't help wire the brain. And this quote, I think, sums it all up. You know, we're wired for sound, but when we talk about adding print, that can be like painstakingly bolting on an entirely new skill set for the brain. So the other thing that we see over time is that our students, were in school, many of them, but they didn't get any better than like their peers. So, over time, we would expect that students would gain more skills and, going from kindergarten to whatever grade they're in, that those skills are going to increase commensurate to the text that they're encountering. With students who struggle, though, that's not what happens. They start often okay in kindergarten and first grade when the words are very easy, when there's a lot of support for learning to read, but over time, that gap gets wider and wider. Because starting in about fourth grade, we shift from learning to read to reading to learn. And so the expectation is that students will be able to read independently and then interact with that text, either by doing a quiz or writing about something or whatever. So students will get into upper grades and definitely into adulthood, and they don't have those skills, and they don't get any better based on age. So the earlier we can intervene and the more effectively we can intervene, the better. So now when we're talking about the components of reading instruction, what we know is that comprehension, again, is what we're really focused on. But we have to, when we have a reader that is not reading proficiently, we have to identify the real cause of what that is. And so often that's where we get into those components, actual components of reading that may start with phonemic awareness. A lot of students cannot hear certain sounds. They can't discriminate between sounds. I know you probably see this all the time, where a student can't tell the difference between and and ah. And they don't actually know some of the sounds for some of the letters. So we could start at the top, like we've been doing, and do a top-down approach. But isn't it more effective to start at the bottom, assess for what they have already and what they need, and then work our way up? It's just a much more efficient way of identifying where gaps are and closing those gaps more quickly on our way to comprehension, again, weaving in those additional strands that will lead there. So now when we look at the simple view reading, we can see that it is simple in the sense of these are the two components, but within those two components, there are a lot of pieces that will lead to comprehension. So for example, phonology is sound, our speech sounds, orthography is what happens in print, and then morphology is meaning. So a lot, again, vocabulary, but also just how languages work in terms of meaning. And then within comprehension of language, it gets even more complicated. So to really be effective instructors who can help our students become proficient, we have to really think about how do we connect all those skills. And that's where structured literacy comes in. Structured literacy is the model that has been shown to be the most effective. It was a term adopted by the International Dyslexia Association, and the outer ring shows the principles of structured literacy, which are how we teach. And that starts with being explicit. We don't assume that even somebody who's, well into their adulthood knows the, sounds and letters. We are going to always assess, not assume. Second, things have to be systematic. Again, when people bring knowledge into the classroom, that's great. But if everybody's knowledge base is different, then that's not systematic. There needs to be a process whereby that's consistent among teachers, between classrooms, between programs so that we're all speaking the same language so that we can track students more effectively in a continuum. There's so many reasons why that systematic is part of a structured literacy program. Cumulative is really, really important because if we're going to move from simple to more complex, which is exactly what our students need, we have to ensure that we're building on previous skills. And I see so many programs and teachers who are throwing too much at their students. So they're dealing with short and long vowels and, many types of vowel teams all at the same time. Our students can't handle that. So we need to go systematically from simple to more complex in a way that is actually the structure of the language, which it turns out goes from simple to more complex. And then what was added from the pyramid to the structured literacy model is the diagnostic piece. As we're going through the work with our students, we need to constantly be assessing and adapting instruction based on what we're seeing. If we're not checking in and actually seeing work product from our student and how they're able to apply those skills, we're doing what's been done for a long time is they continue to make errors and there's nobody stopping them and saying, wait a minute, I think you might be confused about how this skill works. Let me make sure that you're really clear about it. So those principles are incredibly important. The inner circle are the elements, and that comes back to what we've been talking about. It starts with phonology, the speech sounds, sound symbol correspondence, making sure that students know how sounds connect to letters. Syllables is an incredibly complex process of understanding how to go to some, very simple words. A lot of our students can do those simple CVC words quite easily. Where they struggle and have great difficulty often is when they get to multisyllabic words. And again, I've seen many, many ways of teaching syllables, and they're way too complex for most of our students when we can simplify that process. Morphology has to be built in, meaning as it can be as simple as, you have a noun dog, you add the letter S, and that becomes, we go from singular to plural. That one little letter S has meaning in it. It changes the meaning. What's the difference between a cookie and the cookie? Those articles. So morphology and even the spelling of a lot of our words does make sense when you understand why the word is spelled that way. Syntax is word order. Every language has a structure to it. And students learn syntax best when they translanguage, if they're coming from one language to another, when they can see and compare the syntax. So we have to help them understand the syntax in English. And the semantics is word choice. So, do crying, weeping, and sobbing all mean exactly the same thing? No, they don't. There's some variation there. So why do authors use some words? Why does this word matter in what we're reading and that comprehension piece? And so syntax and semantics are best taught when they're embedded in what students are reading and writing, because that's where they'll get the practice. So structured literacy is the key. This is just one example of what a structured literacy lesson could look like in 30 minutes. And the reason 30 minutes is kind of the sweet spot is if you've ever worked with really struggling readers and English language learners, after about 30 minutes, they fade. They start to make errors because this is, remember, we're creating neural pathways in the brain. It's exhausting. And so 30-minute increments on a regular basis, very consistently, is actually the best way to apply these skills. So what would that look like in a 30-minute lesson? Well, first, we're always going to start with a review because we need to make sure that students have retained the skill and can apply the skill before we move on into more complex areas. So checking with students by having them do a performance task, not talking about what the review was and what we went over, but actually having them do something connected to that prior skill. Very important for that diagnostic piece. Then instruction should be limited to the next level of skills. So if it's a more complex skill, then it's going to take multiple sessions to cover that skill. We want to break it down into what can we provide in about a 10-minute segment of instruction. And then we're going to go into something called dictation, which is guided practice, where students are working with the instructor and making sure that they're, hearing it, they're reading it, they're spelling it. So that multimodal component, that's really what wires the brain most effectively. And then initial transfer is allowing students to take words from skills from words in isolation into text. And initial transfer is often where we get into decodable passages. And in the past, there haven't really been very many decodable options available for adults. What was decodable were things that were designed for kindergarten and first grade. The last thing you want to put in front of an older learner who's struggling, because again, that just reinforces that, they can't do it at their level. So initial transfer should generally be some way of assessing that students can apply these skills now in some text that they should be able to build accuracy, automaticity, fluency, and confidence with. And then at another time, so not in that same 30-minute block, we do extended transfer and differentiation. This is where we move students into whatever it is they're going to be reading. And for students, that can be a very different level. So we talked about some of those, but we're going to talk about more. So when we're talking about that guided practice, this is that multimodal piece that really wires the brain. And there are two components that really build those neural pathways. One is as we mentioned, the phonological loop, so sounds, where students are seeing things, they're hearing things, they're reading things, so they say it, but also connecting it to print. So again, hearing it, writing it, reading it, and going back and forth between those two with a targeted response so that they're getting that diagnostic piece so we can check for understanding and application. Really incredibly important. And then we want to move them into that transfer to reading and writing with authentic connected text. So again, that may start in the beginning with decodable things, words and passages that are connected to the skill that they've been working on, so that we're not throwing patterns and words and concepts in front of them that they have not already had that instruction and practice with. And then moving from there to things that may be leveled or at an approximate reading level for them. So again, that they can build vocabulary and comprehension skills. And then move them into, this is extended transfer. So, all good structured literacy programs should also identify how do we get students moving into where they're going next. And in the beginning, that may just be with looking for patterns and helping them address some of those basic issues in text. But as they gain more skills, we have to make that connection. Good structured literacy programs are the bridge to proficient reading of whatever students are going to be reading. So for some students, and often we kind of assume this in adult ed or corrections, that, they're trying to get a GED or, they're trying to get in a vocational training program or something related to a job. But that's not always the case. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories. And this is where we can build some instant motivation. One of the questions that is really helpful to ask when you're working with students and really tease us out a little bit more than we often do is to say, what is it that you really want to read? How is this going to support something that is a goal for you? So I'm going to tell you the first story. This was an older woman who had been in the country for about 25 years. So her oral language speech was excellent. She could speak and understand anything that you needed to. She owned a cleaning business, but she couldn't read or write in English. So what would happen is her customers would leave notes for her about what they wanted done when she came to clean the house. And she would take those notes, she would crumple them up and put them in her pocket because she couldn't read them. So as we were working through, her gaining decoding and encoding skills, I said, bring the notes so we can see what they're asking you to do and what words are common. You're going to see them over and over again. And in a notebook, we started to identify those words that are very common. And because she, came from another language, she would often just translate them next to it in the notebook. So she would know what the word meant. If she didn't already know it. And then she could really start to connect those notes. And over time, she didn't need help with those notes anymore because she could read. She had the skills and she had the connection to the words and concepts that she was going to see. But that's not always the case either. Another student her goal really was to learn to help her grandchildren or to read with her grandchildren. And at the time, her grandchildren were really into the Magic Tree House books. And I was like, great, because Magic Tree House, if you're familiar with them at all, all take place in a different setting. They all have vocabulary and concepts and, things that are, in time connected to that setting. And so they're really valuable. They can get into way more complex kinds of words. And so that was her goal. Another student, we asked, what is your goal? And their goal really was to get into real estate. Well, then guess what? Should we be doing is not only focusing on all the skills and the other things that they need, but helping them to bridge to what it is they're going to be using those reading skills for. And you'll see motivation go way up when we can really identify ways to support students in gaining those goals. So for many of our students, we're talking about beginning with the foundational skills that will lead to those more proficiency in reading and writing. And this is true of all readers, obviously, but this is particularly true with multilingual learners. So when we've got a student who's an English speaker, but is a low-level reader, then we're generally going to start with the basics. Again, the phonology, sound symbol correspondence, decoding, spelling, etc. And then we're going to move over time to academic vocabulary and text, or whatever it is the student wants to read that's of more complexity, right? With multilingual learners, this is even more important because vocabulary means that we're not just talking about words, but we're talking about what those words mean in English. So students who come to us with oral language, any other oral language, still have to make the connection to meaning in English. And for them, we have to ensure that we're checking for gaps as they go along because their instruction often looks different. And we're seeing more and more refugees, students with interrupted formal education, and many who are not literate in their primary language. So there are a lot of challenges that come with that, which means that spectrum really has to be a key component as we're thinking about moving students from the foundational skills to proficiency. So there are 44 sounds in English, 44 phonemes, and that's double, for example, the number of phonemes in Spanish because their vowels don't change and ours do. And that can make it really challenging. So for many students and students with, phonemic awareness deficits that often come with dyslexia or hearing challenges or whatever, it's really helpful to have a resource or a way for students to be able to hear and see what the mouth is doing and really attend to that phonology piece as they're connecting to print. For our lowest level readers and for our English language learners, especially newcomers to the language or those in, level 1 and 2, what we're really focusing on of all the phonemic awareness skills and connecting to print are 2 skills. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, but really it comes down to this. When you hear the word bag and you go to spell the word bag, what your brain is actually doing is segmenting. So unconsciously you think ag, and what letter is connected to that sound. So that's segmenting. When we read, we do the opposite. Now we're blending those sounds together to get the word bag, right? So in the beginning, the foundational skills with phonemic awareness and connecting to print have to really focus on blending and segmenting, which is why those initial skills are so incredibly important because many of our students never got that and nobody has ever gone back far enough to make sure they did. So we really want to focus on that. So if you're thinking about or trying to implement a structured literacy program of any type, there are really 6 primary components of that. One is time. Depending on the level of gap that students have, the minimum recommendation is 150 minutes a week. So that could be 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week in adult ed, and that could happen in corrections if that were scheduled. It doesn't often happen in adult ed programs where you might see your students 2 or 3 times a week. So if there's something that they can be doing, again, leveraging resources and self-directed kinds of activities, that is great. But again, scheduling is a key component, making sure that students have enough time. Educators, who's actually providing this level of instruction? And it starts with training. So at COABE, it was really interesting in my session how many people talked about the fact that, yep, they had a curriculum, they'd never been trained to use it, or they came in new and they'd never really had any follow-up. And so having all the knowledge in the world, then you get some sort of curriculum, but you've never been trained in that curriculum, or you're new to this whole world of foundational reading skills and you've never been trained to do that either, is a huge issue. But it's not just that. It's not just training. It's, the enthusiasm and the passion about doing this. And I think most of the teachers who work in these settings have, they're very supportive. Their goal is to really make the difference for their students. But we need to make sure they have the knowledge and the training to do that. And part of that, and I'm sure you would all agree, is relationships. These are students who have struggled generally their entire lives, and they're really worried about other people knowing they can't read or can't read well. And so, those relationships and creating safe spaces is really important. And because of that, it's also important to think about in the beginning with foundational skills about appropriately identifying and grouping students based on similar levels. If you're working in classrooms with mixed levels where you've got students who are very low and students who are much higher, you know that it's very challenging to try and meet the needs of all your students. And in corrections, there's a huge issue because a lower level student, there's street cred. You don't want to appear vulnerable in front of peers. And so as soon as somebody laughs or makes a comment, that shuts everybody down. And that really can deter everything you're trying to do. So again, thinking about how we structure our structured literacy program is really important with time, with who's doing it, and then how we're going to set it up with scheduling. But you also have to have a structured literacy curriculum. You have to have something that applies the science of reading and does that in a way that's designed for older students. And that's been a missing piece in lots of what we've been doing over time. And then as we're doing this, again, impacting the social, emotional, and psychological effects that often they have been dealing with. And that means if you're going to have a student read or you're doing some sort of assessment, we're doing that in private, not in front of other people. Sometimes what works well for us is we've got students on software with earbuds or headphones, and they can't hear what other students are doing. So we're differentiating even with that. We think about, instead of thinking about it really as intervention, it's more about the structure of, it's more about linguistics, which is the study of English. And that's a class most people would take in college. And when you talk to your students about the fact that the reason we're talking about vowels and things like that is really because this is the study of linguistics, our language. But the missing piece has been this extended transfer piece. So providing students with a way to apply all these skills in increasingly complex text, but connected to their life experience. So I'm going to transition a little bit now to introducing something. So I want you to think about when you first learned to drive. And for some of us, like me, that was a very long time ago. But I do remember that, getting introduced to these are the parts of the car and this is how things work. And when I do a rental car now, I kind of have to do that all over again. Like, where's the windshield wipers and where's the lights? And then you had to learn the rules of the road, right? So in order to get a driver's license, you had to get really a good understanding of what the rules were, right? And then I'd love to have some people put this in the chat. Where did you first learn to drive? So you maybe took a driver's ed class or something like that, but when you were going to practice, where did you practice? So at COABE, somebody said, I practice in the cemetery. Some people talked about, another setting, but generally what that looked like is some safe space where you could get a lot of practice and it was low stakes. You weren't going to run into other people, etc. And you practiced until you felt confident enough and comfortable enough to move into actual driving. And now, if you're like me, I drive myself home. I don't even know how I got there. It is such an automatic process that I can be thinking about lots of other things, and I don't even know how I got home. I just get there. My car steers itself there. Those 3 steps are part of what we know about the stages of learning for essentially any age and anything. And it's aware, awkward, and automatic. So we start by needing to be aware of something like the car and the rules of the road, but this applies to anything and certainly applies to an understanding of reading and the components of reading. Then during practice, you're in the awkward stage because when I first learned to drive, too much brake, not enough brake, too much gas, not enough gas, all the things that you have to do. And that feels uncomfortable. It can be, people feel really self-conscious, and it does feel awkward. So the whole point is you want to give your students enough time to practice so that they get to the point where they're ready to get on the road. And that's where we get into automaticity. And that's the ability now to use that skill pretty effortlessly. So if you think about how this applies to reading, I love this description of it because it's fast, effortless word recognition. That's where fluency comes from. That's where comprehension is built from, because now we don't have to attend to decoding the words. We can focus more on vocabulary and those upper strands, right? This is what has been a challenge, though, because often with our foundational programs, we are explaining some things, we are giving them some practice, but are we getting them into the actual authentic connected text that is their goal? And are we applying those skills or bridging those skills into that kind of text? So an example, I was doing training at an adult ed program a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about an English language learner, and the English language learner, what she needed to be able to do was read notes that were coming home from the school. So maybe there's a field trip permission slip or some sort of notification. And so I said, well, what would you do to help her? And they said, we'd have her bring the notes. Yes, absolutely. So you can start translating, helping her understand. Sometimes there's great apps out there that can help with that. But I said, we could even take it further. What about creating a template for things she has to write? So for example, if your child is sick, or even getting their signature in English or printing their name, but then giving them a template so that, it's like a note that they would fill out, so that they have copies of that so they can start to really apply that and thinking more about how do we do that. So that's really the focus of taking students, which is more motivating and actually embeds the skills in ways they need it. So we're going to transition to one last piece, and this is hopefully something that you'll be able to apply. We have a lot more research now, and sometimes what we've been doing is we've been disconnecting writing from what they're reading, and the research shows that writing really improves when we connect to what we're reading. So this is a great study if you're interested. It really does break down how, if we're going to get students into those especially upper level skills like a GED or pre-GED, where it's in science and social studies, we want to write about what you're reading. But how do we do that? So I'm going to teach you a really simple process called paragraph shrinking, and we're going to practice that a little bit just for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to stop and take questions. So paragraph shrinking is literally done by paragraph. So this would be generally where you've got, passages of multiple paragraphs. And the first goal is to find the who or what of the paragraph. So what is that paragraph about? Who and what? And then to identify the most important thing about the who or the what. And then to write a main idea, a summary sentence in 15 words or less. So take all that information and put it in one sentence. Okay, so we're going to practice or just basically get an idea of what that would look like. So this is a passage. You can see this is paragraph 1. And I want you to just read this very quickly and see if you can find the who and the what of the sentence, and find the most important thing about that paragraph, and write a sentence that's 15 words or less. So I'm going to give you just a second, read it, see if you can find the who or what and what's most important. And then write a sentence. And when you have one, put it in the chat. So this has to be a whole sentence. Okay, great. Rick, thank you. You're the first one on it. It has to be a whole sentence. And so I talked to people and they're like, yeah, we annotate or we do notes. Nope, this has to be a whole sentence. How are we going to move students into writing and really all the conventions and syntax if we don't do real sentences? So what you're doing is you're creating for every paragraph a summary sentence of the information that's most important in that paragraph. So keep going. I love it. Okay, so now let's look at the next one. So this is the second paragraph. This is the paragraph after that. So I just want you to quickly skim this. And then I want you to think about what challenges might your students have in shrinking a paragraph like this, because this is informational text, which is what they would encounter, right? What challenges do you think they might have in trying to do this activity with a paragraph like that? So, and then how does it support reading, writing, and comprehension? So this is, for example, what do we do at the beginning of every sentence? That's sometimes a basic skill that we don't see in lots of older students. Having the right kinds of punctuation often don't show up, things like that. So let me see if somebody put things in the chat about that. Yes, so much information, no background knowledge, lots of details. Don't you find a lot of times that the issue really is that they don't know what's the most important? There's too much information. How do they choose it? And that can be so valuable to help them identify that. This is particularly true when it's going to revolve around inference, because helping them to find the evidence and text to support that what's being asked can often be a real challenge. So it's just a great skill. It's really easy. But the best part of it is because they're writing it in a notebook or whatever, at the end of sometimes a longer paragraph, a longer passage, you've got a summary of every single paragraph. So at the end, they really have the gist of the entire paragraph, and you can even have them do a summary sentence at the end of, specifically, what was the key part of this. So now what I'd love to do, that's all I'm going to share today, because we're getting close to the end of time and I want to make sure there are times for questions if there are any. What I would really love to see is if you could, what's one thing that you took away from all this information, that's usable or actionable, something you could start doing, do more of, or change doing that might be more effective in your practice. And I'll give you just a minute to do that. Because webinars are great, but we want to be able to take that information and apply it just like we want our students to do that. Well, I love that. Love it. So obviously you'll get a recording of this. You'll have that paragraph shrinking activity in the slides and all of that. But I do want to make sure we have enough time to talk about a couple of other things. One is we're going to be sharing a resource after this, so you can download it, called The 4 Literacy Myths of Adult Learners, which really does identify a lot of the things we've thought about adult learners and literacy, and why those sometimes are actually not even true. We'll also send you a link if you're interested in exploring more about Reading Horizons Elevate, which is the program for adults. You'll have a link, so you can do that. And then we've got 2 webinars coming up. So in May, on the 15th, we'll be doing a session specifically on recognizing and responding to dyslexia in adults. That is a huge issue with adults. We know that in incarcerated populations, that's probably double. But that's true of adult ed. We see that as well all the time. And then in June, the session will focus on applying the science of reading to English language instruction for our English language learners. And this is a session that I presented at TESOL, which was the 3 days right after the COABE conference. And again, that was, people thought that was really valuable information. And so we'd love to present that in a webinar. Okay, so questions, discussion. Let me just check the chat. John Lightsey, you have had your hand raised since the beginning. So do you want to, let me see if you put things in the Q&A, that's where it's easiest for us to see it. So I don't see any questions in there now. So if you can put questions in the Q&A piece, that would be great. And I'll look in the chat as well, just to see. Thanks, Joan. Affirmed much of what I believe. And I think that's the key, that we've known a lot of these things. We just didn't have a confirmation or an understanding of why they were happening. And there weren't a lot of resources and support for what we needed to do to change that or to become more effective. So we're very glad you joined us. You'll get the recording and some resources in addition. I see a question. Oh, what is the age range of these students? So at this point, we're talking only about adults. So, but it applies exactly to secondary student, anybody above 4th grade, actually, because they need essentially the same things. Past those primary grades, when they do need to see things that are juvenile, for children, everything else for students should look age appropriate. What type of diagnostic activities would you recommend for a new student? Oh, that's a great question. And boy, I could do a whole webinar on that. There has to be a way to screen first for phonology and sound symbol correspondence. That could be as easy as asking students a jump, we have different resources, but, mixing up letters and asking them to tell you the name and the sound of the letter. Not using the ABCs to do that, but out of order. You'll often also hear students that will have reversals with B and D, so they'll get to a B and they'll say D and opposite. So you'll also identify a lot of things like that. And then the goal always is to start with short vowel sounds and one sound for every letter. So we use only the short vowel sounds to start, the hard sound of C and G, and the consonant sound for Y, so that there are 26 letters and 26 sounds. And that's what they focus on before we add any of those other phonemes, spellings, etc. There are some good ones out there. If you want to look at free ones, there's the Core Phonics Screener. There's a number of them, but that's probably where I would start because it's so easy to find. Why are there so many students with dyslexia? That's a great question. We know that dyslexia is neurobiological, which means it happens in the brain, but it's also biological. So a hugely genetic component. So often it runs in families. Would you recommend a resource to learn more about the research of teaching reading to adults, specifically to adults? I always recommend David Kilpatrick's book because it is the best summary of all the research. It's called Essentials for Assessing something of Reading Difficulties. David Kilpatrick, look it up. It's going to be all over everywhere. Yes, Tony, you were on the right track. Some of my students get very frustrated by reviewing, going over similar material when they haven't mastered the topic. Do you have any suggestions for addressing this frustration? It kind of depends on what's the similar material. So is it the material? Is it that it's something that you're not demonstrating, allowing them to demonstrate proficiency? So this is what happens with adults. We want to see, can they already apply a skill? If they can, we don't want to bog them down in information they already know. We want to see how they can apply it. So then what are you using to apply it? So if they're frustrated because of the material, that's one issue. And again, I would just start by asking, what is it that you want to read, and making sure that they can see a direct connection to, to what they want to do, what their goals are. So unfortunately, our time is up. Those were great questions. Thank you so much for being so participatory. It's a great topic, and I know there's a webinar poll. And again, we're going to have 2 additional webinars on really important topics for adult educators. So we hope to see you back.
Thank you so much, Laura. What a wonderful presentation. I always love it when there's so much interaction between the participants and the presenters. That was really, really well done, and what a great topic. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Before you log off, if you could just fill out that 1 question poll. Looks like most everybody did. As a reminder, I know Laura mentioned this earlier, but this replay of the webinar will be posted to coabe.org. You'll get an email with a link to that, and you'll also get your certificate of completion emailed to you, and all of the resources that Laura provides as well will be available. So with that, Laura, if you have any final words, we'll sign off for today.
I just want to say that what you're doing is such important work, and we value how much your commitment even shows by showing up for a webinar. So thank you so much for joining.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, everybody. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week and a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.